You're listening to CINEBINGE.
Welcome to CINEBINGE. This show was born from my friend's persistence in me watching certain shows.
I've been asking Simon to watch Dark, a German TV show on Netflix, which I guarantee he will like. But for some reason, he's always been a little apprehensive about watching it.
So I said, I'll watch it if we can put a podcast around it. And this is that podcast. Welcome to CINEBINGE. My name's Simon.
And my name's Andrew.
And today we are talking about episode 7.
Crossroads.
Momentum is starting to really build up now.
Definitely.
I think this is the first episode where it was going from present day to 1986 quite regularly. Like it wasn't a show that the whole episode wasn't just set in one time. It was bouncing quite a lot through it. That was quite hard to get used to at first.
You know what makes it hard to follow in that sense is that a lot of TV shows would have actually put the year on the screen every time it went back and forth to help you keep track. Whereas this doesn't do that. All this does, and we were talking about sound design in the last episode. And again, it's the sound design around the transition when they move between the periods. There is a kind of rushing sound followed by the sound of a clock. Sometimes it's like a really sharp snipping sound, like the tick-tock sound. It will always be there, which would indicate the passage of time jumping backwards between the two time periods. That's consistent. Every time they move between those two time periods, you always get that same transition.
I'll have to listen out to that.
Which, again, is why I said in the previous episode when we were talking about this, and I said that you really have to pay attention to what's going on, because it's not just necessarily the scene that you're watching that's important. It's also the transition that takes you into the next scene. And if you've not been paying attention, it's very easy to miss which year you've jumped to. So Crossroads is, as you say, very momentum starting to build very quickly now. We've got Ulrich really kind of getting into the investigation about what happened with his son and potentially how it might be linked to his brother's disappearance way back then as well. He's got his heart set on Helga being involved in some way, certainly in 1986, and is refusing to believe that he's not involved in his son's disappearance as well, despite him now being in a nursing home. So there's certainly something around that, and he's desperate to find out what happened back then and why Helga didn't go and visit the police station like he was asked to. I mean, while this is going on, we've also got Jonas back in 1986 searching for his father as a young boy, still sort of Mikkel. He seems to think that he can probably return Mikkel back to his present time, until he's obviously warned against that and the consequences of doing so, what that would mean for Jonas himself, which obviously explores the usual kind of tropes around time travel. So, yeah, some interesting questions are being raised, certainly in this episode, quite a few, in fact. And we also get perhaps one major answer around who we were previously calling Mr. Dark as well. So that's another thing we can talk about.
So the show opens with the death room, as I think anyone in there would call it. And we show this kid whose face is covered in blood. And the first thing I wondered was, is that his blood or is that from someone else? It wasn't really clear. The cinematography in this episode was really, really good, and it was pointing things out subtly, but enough for you to go, like, wants me to look at that. As I was watching this at the very beginning, it seemed to let you look at the wallpaper, and I thought, why is it letting me look at the wallpaper? Like, this is important, with all good reason, because later on we find out the hatch or that room, that is the death room, that was the blue room, because the detective lady goes in and she finds a piece of this wallpaper, and you're like, oh my, this is starting to, well, it's not starting to give you any answers apart from potentially what that room is. Like, you know, for all we know, it might just have people who's got similar taste in wallpaper. And I think that was one of the big reveals as well, like what that room is. What's that? The question I've got for you, is what's the relation of Jonas to Hannah? Is that his mum?
Yes, Hannah is Jonas's mum.
So Hannah was having an affair with Ulrich before Mikael committed suicide.
That's never explicitly stated. Certainly it hasn't been up to this point.
But it looks like it is.
I don't know. It's possible. I mean, it depends on how withdrawn her husband was at that point. Maybe she was looking for comfort elsewhere because her husband was, locking himself away in his room perhaps for long periods. But I don't think it was ever explicitly stated in the show that their affair started while her husband was still alive.
But she's always liked Ulrich, and 30 years is a long time for them just to, do you know what I mean? So I think it's probably an on and off type thing.
Fairly high chance that there was an affair going on before the husband passed away, that's for sure.
So we have Jonas, obviously 1986, sees his dad, and you're like, oh my God, is he going to go to him? And we also find out in this episode, we find out quite a few things in this episode that I did ask questions and you wouldn't tell me. And one of the questions was, can someone who has gone back in time go back in the cave and go back to present time? And in this episode, we find out they can.
Yes.
Because there's some sort of fold in time or something that's going on there. Because Jonas does that. After being told by the stranger, don't meddle with time, the path is already been set. And again, this has the same rules as the Back to the Future. If you go back in time and you kill your grandfather, you will disappear because you will never be born.
Yes, it's following that same kind of rule, isn't it? Time travel rule.
Yeah.
As opposed to kind of an alternative view where perhaps you split off into another alternative dimension and a new timeline exists in parallel to your current timeline. That seems to be what it's implying.
The biggest reveal is we see Noah, or at least we think it's Noah, who's got this huge tattoo on his back with the sign that we keep seeing in the show. He's brushing quite manically. We don't know whether it's blood or we don't know what's gone on there, but something has happened in this hatch. We hear the sound first, and then we see Noah with his top off. I think that's where the episode ends. So we're like, clearly he isn't a priest, and clearly he is very, very involved with the whole bigger picture of things. They were the big reveals in this episode, unless I've missed anything, which I don't think I have. They were the things that I was like, oh my God. That's what sort of stood out to me in this episode. And obviously we had the old man waking up and he said, I remember everything. And you're like, okay. Now, my next question to you, the old man who wakes up, is that the security guard?
Yes, that's Helga.
That's not Egon.
That's not Egon, no. The guy who wakes up who says, I remember everything is Helga. He's the guy in the nursing home as an old man. And Charlotte, when Ulrich contacts Charlotte and says, I think Helga was involved in some way. Where was he? What was he doing? And Charlotte's like, well, he's a 77-year-old man with Alzheimer's. You really think he would be involved in what just happened with your son? But that doesn't steer Ulrich away, does it? He goes and basically visits him and tries to interrogate him. Really, what happened back in 1986? Where were you going? What does the Forest Road mean? Why didn't you go and give the interview like you were supposed to? He's giving him a hard time, and Helga seems really spooked by the whole thing, doesn't it? It's like he's really freaked out by this whole situation. He's saying things like, it's him, and then talking about how I can change the past and the future as well was another interesting line that he said at that point.
Sorry, in 1986, where do we see Helga? He's not this policeman, is he?
No, the policeman is Egon Tiedemann.
Right. Okay. The Mr. Dark, that is the guy who works at the power plant. Is that right?
Yep, that's Helga.
That's Helga. Okay, that's where I was getting. Yeah. I couldn't remember if his name was Egon or what. So okay, so Helga, the guy who we see at the end with who we assume is Noah, who's got a body. Mm-hmm. He's in the nursing home.
He's now in the nursing home, yes.
So he knows everything.
He seems to be very key now, doesn't he? He's obviously he seems to have been in the room as a boy assuming that that's him when he woke up at the beginning of the episode saying that he remembers everything. It seems to be. I mean, the common link between the elderly Helga, the middle-aged man Helga, and the young boy is that they all seem to have had damage to that side of the face. So their ear and face is disfigured in that way. So it's you would make a pretty obvious guess there that the boy is Helga and he's remembering being in that blue room as a young boy. Something clearly happened back in his childhood, and then growing up he was working at the power plant, seems to have been involved in obviously suspicious because Egon's interrogating him at the time and saying, you know, why did you take the forest road? There's the whole thing with the rapper, the Raider Bar. We know now that he's also the guy that had the hoodie on, the Mr. Dark character, involved in the sort of dragging away of the young boy's body at the end. Seems to be involved with Noah in some way as part of all of this. So yes, Helga is now a major source of suspicion. You know, I mean, despite the fact that he looks a bit, I guess I would say, upset by what was going on when you see him dealing with the body at the end. There's a tear in his eye. Whatever it is, he seems very remorseful about what's happened. And
you just picked up on a word that I've used quite a few times during these podcasts when we speak about one of the characters, Doppler, saying he seems like he's remorseful about something. And the fact that he seems remorseful after being in this, what we think is the bright blue room. And then we see Peter Doppler, who is also in that room with his dad, is it?
Yes, it's not his dad. So the guy that you saw, Helga Doppler, is Peter Doppler's father.
Correct, yeah.
But in the previous episode, when we saw Peter in the same room, in that bunker, when he was looking at the notepad with the time, and he was in that room with Tronte Nilsson, who is Ulrich's dad. So we now seem to have 4 characters that are connected here. We've got Noah connected to Helga. We've got Helga Doppler connected to Peter Doppler by back to them being father and son. And we also have Peter Doppler connected to Tronte Nilsson, who is Ulrich's father. So there's 4 characters there that all seem very suspicious about what's happening and what's going on here, but we don't quite know exactly what's going on.
I still think when the stranger said to Jonas about not meddling with time, I still think those other characters who were in that room, I think they've gone back in time and grown up from 1986. Don't necessarily think we've met them, but that's what I think. I think they've gone back in time. And the reason why perhaps they're having to kill or do something dark is because they have to, for them to survive, they can't have people meddling with time. So that's that's Simon's theory, which I kind of alluded to last week. But the more I'm watching this, the more I think that is what the overall story is. The darkness is about having to do bad things to stop them meddling with time that will affect their existence.
Yeah, okay. I mean, let's talk about some of the other things that we saw in this episode then, because you're right that I guess Helga Doppler is definitely key to what's going on, but there's a lot of questions still around what actually happened in some of those periods. For example, why is his face all bloody when he was a boy? You know, presume what year was that? What year did that happen in? Taking time travel out of the equation here, it would be assumed that you're talking like the 1950s or something, wouldn't you? Because he was a young boy in that picture, in that scene. So that kind of ties in with what Noah is writing on the wall right at the very end when he writes 2 dates on the wall, and he writes 1953. There's 2 dates. It's the 5th of November 1953 and 9th of November 1953. So 4 days apart, and that would be exactly 33 years earlier than 1986, which is where we were based in parts of this episode and in parts of the previous episode. And there was a couple of other dates that were linked in this episode as well. They made a point on identifying specific dates, which kind of help you get a sense of what the time period is that we're talking about here. So, for example, Charlotte mentions that the 12th of November, I think this is in relation to when Ulrich is talking about how Helga Doppler was meant to have gone to the station, I think, on the 12th of November in 1986. And Charlotte says the 12th of November is 3 days from now. But she's saying that in 2019. But the dates is 3 days from now. Forget about the year. So it's almost like they're implying that these two timelines are running simultaneously, and that the events of the 12th of November 1986 are also happening at the same time as the 12th of November 2019. So when you go between the two, when you go through the cave and you go back and forth, it's the same date in that year, 33 years earlier. So that seems to be like they're very, very much tied, those two dates. So as it stands, when Charlotte mentions that 12th of November is 3 days from now, that would make it the 9th of November today in her world. But in the 1986 scene, if you think about going back to the 1986 scenes where Jonas is in 1986, it would be, and in fact, I think this is confirmed because I believe Jonas talks to the young girl in the school, which is a young version of Regina Tiedemann.
Yeah, she gets bullied a little bit, doesn't she?
Yeah, exactly, her. So she's the one that was tied up in the tree in the previous episode.
Yeah.
Now, Jonas asks her what the date is, and she says, pretty sure she says it's the 9th of November, 1986. So you can see how there's this correlation in the two timelines that they seem to be running simultaneously from our point of view. We're looking at both of them effectively running alongside each other there. So there's some questions around those dates. What happened there? What happened to Helga back in when he was young? They mention an accident that happened, Helga Doppler's accident on the 12th of November, 1986, which is, I think, why he couldn't get to the interview at the police station, because whatever happened on the 12th of November, 1986, apparently happened at the cabin, at the bunker. So we are yet to see that. Based on the fact that we are in the 9th of November now, according to 2019 timeline, at some point you would expect that an episode in the future is going to roll around to the 12th of November 2019, and we are at the same time going to see what happened on that date back in 1986. But it's a good question about what happened, not only as a kid, what then happened as an adult as well. He seems to have been involved in two nasty incidences that we are yet to see on screen.
Were you satisfied with the answers in this show? Not in this episode, but as a whole, were you satisfied with where the whole thing went?
Where the whole thing goes, yes. I am very happy with how the whole thing pans out. I'll tell you that.
Did you predict any of this show?
There are some elements that you may be able to predict. There are some elements that you may still find surprising.
Okay.
You're not necessarily going to predict all of them until later.
Okay.
I think they're doing a good job of. I mean, this episode, for the fact that it tells you basically who Mr. Dark is. We now know who that person is in that hoodie.
Mm-hmm.
It did throw up an awful lot more questions around what happened in the past. And that's the thing that isn't clear at the moment. Is they've gone, oh yeah, all right, we'll give you it. We'll let you know. We'll let you into that little secret that Helga is the guy in the hoodie.
Mm-hmm.
He was the guy that we've seen dragging bodies around, but we don't know his part to play in all of this. We don't know why him and Noah are working together. We don't know what Noah's cause is. We don't know if he is a priest or not, and just happens to also be a bit of a nasty priest, I guess. We don't know what's happening in the bunker, what happened back then, what were they doing in the blue room, what were they doing in whatever time. We don't know what time period that is when it's, I guess it's 1986 because it's the Helga of 1986 in that scene where he's dragging the body away. So presumably that happened in 1986. So there's a lot of stuff to question really around this episode. And you've also got Charlotte. She goes into the cave network and I guess she sees the other side of the door. We saw the door that was previously welded shut from the other side. And I guess we're now seeing the other side of that door. And it's interesting that what she discovers in the cave is some yellow paint, flakes of yellow paint. And
yellow is a colour that appears quite a lot in this show.
It is.
Jonas's jacket is bright yellow. It's on the... as I say, it's on that little part of the cave with the paint.
And what was in that cave previously that was yellow?
The barrels?
Yes. So in the days that have passed, when those barrels were in there back in 1986, was it? They were there and they've been moved. And I guess that ties into the previous episode where the power plant boss, Alexander Tiedemann, was talking to Jürgen Obermann, saying that, we should move some stuff. You remember that scene in the earlier episodes?
Well, Charlotte gets the search warrant for the power plant. Now, that part sort of confused me because she gets a search warrant, but I don't remember seeing her go actually in the power plant. The next thing you see her in a car, and there's it's all open space, so we don't really see that investigation.
Yeah, the scene, essentially what they've done there is they presumably they do go into the power plant at some point, but certainly the scene that you see her walking around, she is inside the grounds of the power plant. But obviously there's a lot of open space in the power plant, the forest and cave system and so on. So she is exploring. And then certainly while that's going on in the background, you see a police search team scouring through the field, trying to see if they've got any sign of evidence that would indicate that Mikkel was there at any point. So there is an ongoing investigation in there. Maybe it's not over yet. I can't remember exactly what's to come in the next few episodes, but maybe this is only the start of the investigation into the power plant and there's more to come.
Do you think Alexander Tiedemann has a resemblance to Noah?
Can't say that I see the likeness, to be honest. I'd have to look at the two photos side by side to get an idea why.
I mean, we haven't seen Noah enough, really. We've seen him dressed as a priest. We've seen him in a car, and we've seen him, we saw a lot of him in this episode. The questions around him are the tattoos on his back.
Yeah.
Why he was brushing. What was he brushing? Why did he write 2 dates on the wall? What time zone was that happening? Was that happening in 1986? Well, hang on. We see the Helga guy. He leaves that room, doesn't he?
He does. He's left the bunker and he's carrying that body away.
And this is all in one shot. And it's young Helga as well, isn't it?
Yes, it's the 1986 Helga that's doing that.
Yeah.
Now, we know that we've seen the priest in previous timelines anyway. So we're not entirely sure, because he's popped up here, we don't know. That's not a really good indication. But certainly Helga is the 1986 version of Helga. So that kind of suggests that it's happening then.
Yeah, so we see Helga and then we hear that sound, brushing, and we go to the shot and we see a very muscly looking Noah look up at the camera. The camera focuses on his back. We see that tattoo with the sign, which isn't the type of tattoo you get tattooed if you're a priest. So in my notes, I've just got one word written for Noah, and that word's devil.
It's interesting you use that word, because we've alluded to that in the previous episode, actually, when we were talking about the potential sort of for an antichrist figure in this. Particularly, and also the other interesting thing about this is the name of the episode. Given that they called it Crossroads. Now, I don't know if you remember when I was talking about Robert Johnson, the blues player, and how his life story, there was a legend of how he had sold his soul to the devil in order to become a great guitarist.
Yeah.
And that was kind of based on the Faustian legend of the man who met the devil at the crossroads and sold his soul to gain fortune. And now here we are again at a crossroads and potential antichrist figures again. So yeah, there's certainly, again, we talked about how there's a lot of different literary and cultural references in this show that keep repeating themselves. And I guess this is another example of that.
The fact that I'm coming to the same conclusion about this guy a few times, and my gut tells me if he's not the devil, he's doing the devil's work.
Yeah, certainly. That's a good interpretation of it.
This episode was a good episode. I liked how it kept moving from time zones. At first, I was a bit disorientated with that, but once I realised that this is what they're doing, it was cool. I don't remember having the best musical montage on this one.
Yeah, I can't say that it stands out particularly well in this particular episode.
But it did have the 80s song. I forget who's that song by? I forget who it's by. Do you know the one I mean?
I'd have to go back and look at the episode.
Flock of Seagulls, I think it is.
Oh, yeah. I Ran So Far Away, A Flock of Seagulls. It must be that you're talking about.
But yeah, they had the song from the Flock of Seagulls, and to say we are in the 80s, just for people who couldn't keep up, I guess. And again, I'd like a nice little school scene with Jonas, and which must have been very... It was kind of like, this was how Back to the Future would really play out. If you went back in time and saw your parents, you wouldn't be like Marty McFly skateboarding everywhere. You'd be like, what the heck?
One of the things I like about this episode is we get to know a little bit more about Egon Tiedemann, the chief of police. Not the chief of police. I forget what role he plays in this.
I thought he came across quite creepy in this episode, if I'm going to be honest. I thought when he picks up Jonas and he takes it, he drives a different way, and Jonas is like, he looks like, what's going on here? And the policeman's got just this creepy vibe. I thought, I don't know about this. I don't like this.
Yeah, it does play out that way, doesn't it? It does seem to feel like there's something
quite sinister
bit odd about him. Yeah, but I also think it's funny how they kind of paint him at that age, I guess, as being a typical kind of older man, in that we've seen him previously interrogating Ulrich and taking a dislike to the music that he was listening to. And obviously with what's been going on around the rape charge against Ulrich as well. And then to just basically come out and go, is Satanism a thing among teenagers? And Jonas is like, what? Where did that come from? No, I don't think it is a thing. He just seems like a typical kind of, he's not with the times, I guess. I think that's basically what I guess his boss was kind of suggesting as well. You're basically near retirement, just retire now and rest.
Yeah,
because it's a bit too long in the tooth for all of this. Well,
especially when he says, "What are those?" and Jonas is like, "What's what?" So, what are those in your pocket? Oh, the headphones. They're not headphones.
Yeah, so it's just like not willing to accept new technology potentially. Admittedly, in this case, it's 30 odd years old.
I remember having earphones like that back in. In the 80s, did they have they had crap headphones, didn't they?
Yeah, I'd say perhaps more 90s than 80s. We'll have to Google that and see when those in-ear earbuds came out, but I'm guessing 90s. You would have thought that they would have been more recognisable as headphones. He would have kind of accepted them to be headphones if they were out in the 80s. So I'm guessing they were 90s and he'd just never seen in-ear headphones before. Yeah. So that's probably what it was. But yeah, no, he just seems, again, he is, obviously Ulrich is stuck in a cell at the moment, waiting for some sort of justice, I guess. Egon is talking to Katerina and asking her, you don't have to protect him. What he's done was bad. And it's interesting as well that her face is bruised. It does throw a little bit of doubt in the story. Maybe he did do something. Or is it somebody else that she's covering for? Because, that whole excuse about falling down the stairs or walking into a door, I think, was it falling down the stairs that she said she did? That was the reason for the bruise?
Yeah, that's true. Because it was like, he didn't touch me, he didn't hurt me. Well, why is your face, what happened?
Yeah. And it's also interesting, that line basically perfectly leads into the next scene where she says, he would never hurt me. And then immediately it switches to the current day and there's that long shot, slow moving camera towards them, and they're having this big heart to heart. I know that you're cheating on me.
I thought that was brilliant.
So hurting her in a completely different way, obviously.
Well, I think as well that for me that so far has been the best shot in the whole series, because it was that slow and it was that subtle. It reminded me of the opening of The Godfather, but in reverse, where we open up on a character talking to Marlon Brando, and it starts off really, really close, and then it slowly like dollies out, pulls out, and then it's revealing stuff as this guy is talking to Marlon Brando. You don't know he's talking to him at this point, And then eventually when the camera pulls out all the way, you then see who he's talking to. And it's just done perfectly, and it's done so slow. You don't really notice it moving unless you remind yourself, oh, that's like, if something's moving really slow, you don't notice it. And it was like that with that scene in this episode, where we start off really quite wide, and then as the conversations get more personal and more intimate and more dramatic, we're getting right in there with the characters, and it's as if it's saying like, this is really important, and it's given no space for them to go, like in the frame, like, do you know what I mean? Like you're putting them that close together that they have to deal with this. It was great.
Just like Ulrich has nowhere to go really in that shot, he's got nowhere to go in that conversation either. It really drills home how big a deal this is really for them.
And it's going to be interesting to see how that part of the show continues to play out, because we didn't really, it didn't really go into that much, that aspect of the show, but it's now gone back to that. That's what I am enjoying with the show as well. Like with other shows where they'll go, now we're going to concentrate on this aspect and then we're going to concentrate on this aspect. This kind of does it in a very natural way. So when it goes to another character, you go, oh yeah, that's going on with that. So it keeps you interested and engaged. I think out of all the plot that is going on, to me, that affair relationship is the least interesting. I imagine that's going to play a much bigger part as it goes and all gets tied together. I hope.
Yeah, maybe. Or it just may be a side plot that doesn't really go anywhere in the end. So we're up to the end of episode 7 now. The next title is actually really interesting. Episode 8 is called As You Sow, So Shall You Reap.
As you sow, so as you will reap.
So you shall reap.
So you shall reap. So that says to me this episode will be about more remorse. So it's like saying what you do, the more you do it, the more you're going to have to like remorse, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a fair, based on that title, you would assume that people are, it's the yin and yang, isn't it? It's whatever you do, you're going to be getting stuff happening back to you, which I guess is, we're going to find out, I guess.
Did you rewatch this episode?
I have rewatched this episode, yes. This is one of my favourite, beyond episode 5 onwards, it is just, for me at least, I'm finding it very hard not to just keep hitting next episode, because I really, I love how it all plays out across the entire seasons, and I just want to keep watching really, and holding myself back and saying, no, let's just discuss this episode with Simon first and see what his thoughts are before we move on to the next one. Here's a question for you. If we weren't doing this podcast now, would you still be watching the show? I
think I would have finished it by now. I probably would have binged it. After episode 5, I would have, watched. I wouldn't have watched it all like in the same day, but I certainly would have watched like, say, one a night and done it like that. Yeah, and I think that is exactly what I was expecting you to find. Had we not been doing the podcast, I was convinced that if you got to episode 5 and you got to the end of it, at that point, that would have been the turning point where you went from, I could easily just like wait a week before watching the next episode. That episode is the turning point where it's suddenly like, no, we need to get another one on. We need to watch another one very soon because this is now really interesting and I want to see where it goes. The only thing I'm disappointed about so far for this episode of CineBinge, as opposed to the episode of the show that we're watching, is that we haven't once made a connection to Lost in this episode. I don't think there's any. Well, the only thing that you could compare this, any Lost references in this is the hatch, really.
The one thing that I like about this is the idea, obviously later on in Lost when we were doing the flashbacks, and I kind of look at this and going, now that we're back and forth between the two time periods, for me, that's basically the equivalent of the Lost flashbacks. Yeah,
that's a good show.
Yeah, a bit of a difference in in Lost, the flashbacks were a few years apart or months apart, as opposed to massive long 33-year gaps as we're seeing in this. But yeah, certainly that idea, the hatch and the flashbacks, I think are the connections to Lost for me.
I tell you what is interesting in the show, that we haven't seen any, apart from children going missing, but we haven't seen anything where there are like bad guys, or it's not like goodies and baddies at this moment in time. We've got suspicions about certain characters. I would say how we had suspicions about characters in Lost, for example, Ethan, or for example, Benjamin Linus. Do you remember what his name was before we found out he was really Benjamin Linus?
I forget his name, but he was pretending to be the pilot, wasn't he?
No, he was pretending to be someone who had parachuted. And remember, they went to find his parachute or whatever it was. And it wasn't his name. Do you not remember that name?
No. I didn't watch Lost as many times as you.
I've only watched it like maybe four times now. In whole, but I mean, it's a long show to watch as well. But yeah, he had this other name. And for, when we were watching that show, this is what I loved about it, because it was before the internet days. We didn't know if he was a good guy or a bad guy. There was times where you think he's actually a good guy, and then he would just completely do something and you go, no, he's the bad guy. But it was the same with a lot of characters in that show. Even the characters we thought were good, that show showed that people aren't just black and white. There's grey, and you can't have more of a grey character than Sawyer. We have a guy who is a con artist. He's a racist hillbilly. But as we find out more about him, we find out why he is how he is, and we find out, when he was young, did his mum got killed, didn't she? And because of this whole affair thing by this con artist, and we find out his name isn't actually Sawyer, his name's James, and that's what I did love about that show. It showed a lot of elements and layers to these characters. I'm not getting that with this at this moment, but what I mean by in the show, we don't know who are the protagonists or antagonists, because it's not really doing that. It might go there, but at the moment, this show feels like it's not revealing anything about. We've got an idea who is potentially a bad dude, and that's Noah. That's the only one we've got in mind, because we've got other characters who seem remorseful, but they don't seem evil. They don't seem bad.
It's almost like they're being directed by Noah at this point. That Helga is being, forced to do stuff against his wishes. And who else? And Peter Doppler was remorseful as well. So again, whatever he's involved in, he seems to be showing regret and not like that he's that evil. Whereas Noah, so far from what we've seen of him, is definitely looking like he's in control. He knows what he's trying to do, and seems to be being painted at the moment as a sinister character. Hence why we were describing him as being sort of potentially the devil. So yeah, I guess in that sense you've got him, and then whenever I see the stranger, I just for some reason automatically think of some sort of friendly Jedi character. So it's I don't know if it's the long hair and the beard about him. He makes me
the big
think
robe.
Yeah, it's all of that. I think it just makes me think that it's like Obi-Wan's lost brother.
You're right though. So it's as if they are doing these things not because they want to, but because the threat that is over their head is bigger than what they are having to do. Yeah.
Well, we'll see how the rest of this plays out. The only other thing that I found really interesting here is that obviously we were seeing this episode was definitely Helga focused, Helga centric, without a doubt. In all of the ages, obviously it opens with him being a young boy.
That's if we think it's him. That's not confirmed, is it?
Well, I think the disfigurement on the side of his face, the blood, would line up with that. So I think we've seen Helga as a young man or an older man with that kind of disfigured ear and face on that side, and we've seen elderly Helga as well with that same marking on his face. So it would be a surprise if it wasn't him, I guess, at this stage. But yeah, the other thing about this was that we didn't actually see or where Helga goes. You know, the elderly Helga who escapes the care home, and Ulrich has gone for a midnight, or not necessarily a midnight visit, but he's gone to pay him a visit fairly late at night, try and get more information out of him. Almost scaring him to death in the daytime wasn't bad enough. He's now going to visit him in the evening as well. And he basically follows him back to the cave. And he seems to know what he's doing, doesn't he? Obviously, the elderly Helga, he goes in there, he gets the light out of this box and starts to navigate through the cave. So he has a purpose there. And it must tie into what he was saying earlier on about, I can fix this, I can change the past and the future and all of this. Whatever it is that he said that he remembers, this must be part of this. He's trying to sort something out. And Ulrich is now following him into cave to see what his plan is, what he's doing. I guess Ulrich just thinks that that's where the body is. I guess he's looking to... it would be a fair assumption from his point of view that if Helga is involved now, even in an elderly age, that perhaps he's going to lead Ulrich right back to Mikkel, either dead or alive.
So there we have it. That is episode 7 of CineBinge. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure you follow us on social media, CineBinge TV for Twitter, CineBinge for Instagram, and we will see you next time.
Boom, done.